6 years after abandoning his wife at the moment she needed him most. Dylan Holloway walked into a corporate boardroom expecting applause. Instead, he stopped mid-step. At the head of the table sat Francesca Holloway, the same woman he had left behind after her cancer diagnosis. The same woman he once called a burden. The company lawyers were already present. So were the board members. And in front of them all, a single document lay waiting. A transfer of controlling shares. Dylan had built the company, but Francesca now owned it. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply watched him realize what the last 6 years had quietly built. If you believe silence doesn't always mean weakness, stay with this story. Before we begin, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that truth has a way of resurfacing even years later, consider subscribing so you don't miss the stories that remind us of that. Now let's go back to the beginning. 6 years earlier, long before the boardroom silence and the transfer of shares, Francesca Holloway lived a quieter life in the suburb of Naperville, Illinois. From the outside, the Holloway family looked like a story that belonged in a business magazine. Dylan Holloway was often introduced that way. At networking events across Chicago, people liked to describe him with the same phrase: a self-made entrepreneur. His company, Holloway Logistics Group, had started small, just 2 delivery trucks and a rented warehouse near Aurora. But within 8 years, it had grown into a regional freight operation, handling distribution contracts across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Dylan was good at telling that story. He told it with confidence. He told it with charm. And he always told it as if he had built everything alone. But the truth of the early years lived in quieter places. It lived in spreadsheets, saved under Francesca's laptop folders. It lived in handwritten notes tucked inside binders. And it lived in the habits she had never stopped practicing. Francesca Holloway had never been a loud person. At 34, she carried herself with a calm that made people underestimate her. She spoke carefully. She listened longer than most people expected. And when conversations moved quickly, she often chose silence over interruption. That silence sometimes made strangers assume she lacked opinions. The reality was simpler. Francesca preferred observation. Before Ethan was born, she had worked in business administration for a small logistics firm outside Chicago. It wasn't glamorous work. Mostly operations coordination, shipment, tracking vendor contracts, route schedules. But she understood systems. She understood where businesses leaked money. And she understood the quiet power of documentation. When Dylan started Holloway Logistics, it was Francesca who helped him build the early framework. She created the first invoicing templates. She organized vendor contracts. She scheduled the first client meetings. At night, when the warehouse workers had gone home and the trucks were parked, Dylan would sit at the kitchen table talking about expansion. Francesca would sit across from him with a notebook. She wrote down everything: dates, client names, payment terms, insurance requirements, mileage costs. She rarely called attention to that work. And Dylan never thought of it as anything extraordinary. To him, it was simply what wives did. Support, encourage, keep the house running, while the real work happened elsewhere. By the time Ethan Holloway was born, the company had grown enough that Dylan was spending most of his time in Chicago. Naperville became the place he returned to at night when schedules allowed. For Francesca, the house became the center of everything. Ethan arrived in early spring, small and loud and curious about the world from the moment he opened his eyes. He followed Francesca everywhere. Through the kitchen, across the living room floor, out to the backyard where delivery trucks occasionally pulled up to drop off paperwork Dylan needed signed. By the time Ethan was 4 years old, he had developed the quiet habit of sitting at the kitchen table while his mother worked. Francesca often kept company documents open on her laptop. Invoices, contract revisions, freight schedules Dylan had forgotten to finalize. She didn't do it because Dylan asked her to. She did it because problems were easier to solve before they became emergencies. Ethan liked watching the screen. "What are you doing?" he once asked. "Helping Dad keep things organized," Francesca said. Ethan accepted the answer without questioning it. Children rarely question the structure of their world. For them, the adults around them simply are the world. By the 5th year of the company's growth, Holloway Logistics had moved into a larger office in Chicago's West Loop. There were now managers, dispatch coordinators, a finance assistant, and a receptionist named Olivia Grant who handled front desk calls. Dylan liked the new office. It made him feel established. He began attending more business events, fundraisers, logistics conferences, startup panels. Photographs from those events sometimes appeared in local business blogs. In those photos, Dylan stood in tailored suits, smiling beside city council members and investors. Francesca was rarely in the pictures. She preferred staying home with Ethan. But that didn't mean she stopped paying attention. On her laptop, a folder labeled Holloway Ops slowly grew larger each year. Inside were Shtira contract drafts, scanned receipts, meeting notes, shipment dispute logs, tax reminders, and emails Dylan forwarded to her late at night, asking, "Can you take a look at this?" Francesca always did. She corrected mistakes quietly. She formatted documents. She reminded Dylan of deadlines. Sometimes she noticed inconsistencies, numbers that didn't align, agreements that lacked signatures. When that happened, she wrote a note, always with a date, always with a short description. It was simply how she worked. Documentation created clarity. Clarity prevented problems. But as the company grew, something else began shifting. Not dramatically, not all at once, just small changes in tone. Dylan started speaking about the company as if it existed entirely within his authority. My trucks, my contracts, my company. At first, Francesca didn't think much of it. Language in business often sounded like that. Ownership was pride. Pride was motivation. But gradually the phrasing hardened. At dinners with investors, Dylan spoke faster, louder, more confidently than ever. When someone asked how the company had scaled so quickly, he would laugh. Long nights and a lot of risk, he'd say. The answer was not technically false. It was simply incomplete. Francesca never corrected him. She rarely attended those dinners anyway. Instead, she stayed home with Ethan, who liked building small towers out of toy trucks on the living room carpet. One evening after Ethan had fallen asleep, Francesca sat alone at the kitchen table, reviewing a shipment contract from a Midwest retailer. Dylan had promised the client delivery timelines that were nearly impossible to meet. She adjusted the document, added buffer days, clarified liability clauses. Then she saved the revision and emailed it back to Dylan. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Dylan, you always catch these things." Francesca read the message and placed the phone back on the table. She didn't reply, not because she was upset, just because she didn't feel the need to. For Francesca, recognition was never the goal. Accuracy was. Outside the kitchen window, the quiet streets of Naperville were already dark. The house was still. And in that silence, Francesca continued the habit that would later matter more than anyone realized. She opened a fresh page in her notebook. At the top, she wrote the date. Then she summarized the contract changes she had just made. Underneath, she added a simple note. Original timeline, unrealistic. Adjusted for compliance. She closed the notebook and placed it beside her laptop. Across the table sat a stack of binders labeled by year. Each one filled slowly. Order, records, context. Francesca didn't think of it as preparation for anything dramatic. It was simply the way she kept the world understandable. What she did not yet know was that within a year, those quiet habits would become the only stable ground left beneath her, because the life that appeared so solid from the outside was already beginning to fracture. And the first crack would arrive in a hospital office, with a diagnosis that changed everything. The first sign that something was wrong arrived quietly. Francesca noticed it on a Tuesday morning in late October. She had been standing in the kitchen packing Ethan's lunch for preschool when a wave of dizziness moved through her so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the counter. It lasted only a few seconds, but it left behind a strange heaviness in her body. She told herself it was fatigue. The previous weeks had been busy. Dylan had been traveling between Chicago and Milwaukee to negotiate a distribution contract, and Francesca had been handling most of the house responsibilities alone. Fatigue seemed reasonable, but the dizziness came back 2 days later, then again the following week. It was accompanied by a persistent ache in her lower abdomen, something dull and difficult to describe. Not sharp, not severe, just present. Francesca ignored it at first. Many people did. Life rarely paused for small discomforts, but Francesca was not careless with patterns. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, she opened the small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote October 18th dizziness while cooking. 2 days later, she added another line. October 20th, same dizziness brief. Lower abdominal pressure. The entries were short, objective, just observations. By the time the third entry appeared, Francesca decided it was time to see a doctor. She scheduled an appointment at Northwestern Medicine in Naperville. The physician she met was calm and attentive. Dr. Laura Bennett, an oncologist who had spent years learning how to deliver difficult information carefully. At first, the appointment seemed routine. Dr. Bennett asked questions about fatigue, about appetite, about pain. Francesca answered each one precisely. She described the dizziness, the abdominal pressure, the unusual exhaustion that lingered even after a full night's sleep. Dr. Bennett listened without interruption. Then she ordered tests, blood panels, an ultrasound. Nothing alarming was said out loud. But Francesca noticed the subtle shift in the doctor's tone. Professional, measured, careful. It was the tone doctors used when they were beginning to suspect something they had not yet confirmed. The tests took place over the next week. Each one added another small piece to a puzzle Francesca could feel forming around her. She continued her daily routines, packing Ethan's lunch, answering emails for Dylan, reviewing a supplier contract he had forwarded late one night with the message, "Need this cleaned up before tomorrow." Francesca completed the revisions. She saved the file. She sent it back. And then she waited. The call from Dr. Bennett came on a gray Monday afternoon. Francesca was folding laundry in the living room while Ethan built a racetrack out of toy trucks on the floor. Her phone vibrated against the coffee table. She glanced at the screen. Northwestern Medicine. Francesca answered calmly. Dr. Bennett's voice carried the same careful tone as before. "Francesca, the test results came back. I'd like you to come into the office so we can talk about them together." Francesca paused for a moment. "Is it serious?" There was a short silence. "Yes," Dr. Bennett said gently. "We should talk in person." The appointment was scheduled for the next morning. Francesca did not panic. Instead, she followed the same pattern she had followed her entire adult life. She prepared. That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, she opened her notebook again. At the top of the page, she wrote Appointment Dr. Bennett. Results discussion. Then she made a list of questions. Possible diagnoses. Treatment options. Recovery timelines. Insurance coverage. Childcare planning. She did not yet know what answer awaited her. But uncertainty to Francesca was simply another form of information waiting to be organized. The next morning, the hospital waiting room was quiet. Soft lighting, muted conversations, the kind of place where time moved slower than usual. Francesca sat with her hands folded in her lap. Across from her, an elderly couple held each other's hands. Neither spoke. Dr. Bennett appeared a few minutes later. "Francesca," she said gently. They walked together into a consultation room. The doctor closed the door, and then she explained. The ultrasound had revealed abnormal tissue growth. Additional imaging and blood markers confirmed the suspicion. Francesca listened carefully as Dr. Bennett spoke. The words arrived clearly. Measured. Precise. Stage 2, ovarian cancer. For a moment, the room felt unusually quiet. Francesca did not cry. She did not interrupt. She simply absorbed the information. Dr. Bennett continued. The cancer had been detected early enough to treat, but treatment would require surgery and several months of chemotherapy. It would be difficult. There would be fatigue, side effects, long recovery periods. Francesca nodded slowly. Her mind had already begun organizing the implications. Medical appointments, insurance coordination, child care arrangements, work adjustments. Dr. Bennett finished explaining the treatment plan and leaned slightly forward. Do you have someone at home who can support you through this? Francesca thought of Dylan. He was in Chicago that morning preparing for a meeting with a potential investor. Yes, she said quietly. My husband. Dr. Bennett nodded. That will help. Francesca left the hospital with a folder of medical documents. The autumn air outside felt cooler than she expected. For several minutes, she simply sat in her car. Not crying, just thinking. Her first thought was not about herself. It was about Ethan. He was only 4. Children that age measured time differently. A week could feel like forever. Francesca opened the folder and read the treatment schedule again. Surgery consultation, pre-treatment testing, chemotherapy cycles, months of medical appointments. Her second thought was about Dylan, not his reaction, his availability. He had been spending more time in Chicago recently, more dinners with investors, more overnight stays near the office. Francesca placed the folder on the passenger seat and started the engine. When she arrived home, Ethan ran toward the door the moment he heard the car. Mom. He wrapped his arms around her waist. Francesca held him for a moment longer than usual. Did you have a good morning? She asked. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Miss Carter let me draw trucks. Francesca smiled softly. That afternoon, Dylan returned home earlier than usual. He walked into the kitchen while Francesca was preparing dinner. She looked up from the cutting board. We need to talk, she said. Dylan loosened his tie and sat at the table. What's going on? Francesca placed the medical folder in front of him. I went to the doctor today. Dylan opened the folder. He skimmed the first page, then the second. His expression shifted slowly. Not panic, not sorrow. Something more complicated. Calculation. How serious is it? He asked. Stage 2. Ovarian cancer. The room became quiet. Dylan leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Francesca watched him carefully, not searching for comfort, just observing. Finally, Dylan spoke. What does treatment look like? Surgery? Then chemotherapy? How long? Several months. Dylan nodded slowly. His gaze moved toward the window, as if he were already thinking about something else. Business schedules, travel plans, financial implications. Francesca noticed the distance forming in his expression. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Fear looked different in different people. Some people reached closer when life became fragile. Others stepped away. Dylan did not yet say anything cruel. He did not raise his voice. But something inside the room had shifted. The warmth that once existed between them had cooled into something uncertain. Francesca closed the folder. Across the hall, Ethan's laughter echoed from the living room as he pushed toy trucks across the carpet. Francesca listened to that sound. Then she returned her attention to Dylan. And quietly, without announcing it to anyone, she began paying closer attention to everything that followed. Because while illness would soon test her strength in ways she had never imagined, it would also reveal a truth about her marriage that Dylan believed she would never fully understand. The first few days after the diagnosis passed in a strange kind of quiet. Nothing collapsed immediately. No shouting, no dramatic arguments. Life simply continued, though something invisible had shifted inside the house. Francesca noticed it in the small pauses between Dylan's sentences. He asked practical questions about the surgery date, about insurance coverage, about recovery time. His tone remained controlled, professional. almost the same tone he used when discussing business plans. At first, Francesca interpreted it as shock. People processed difficult news differently. Some needed time before emotions appeared. But as the days moved forward, the distance in Dylan's behavior did not soften. It sharpened. He began leaving the house earlier in the mornings, returning later at night. Sometimes he said he had meetings. Sometimes he simply said he needed to stay in Chicago for work. The Holloway logistics office in the West Loop had always demanded long hours, but the pattern now felt different, more deliberate. Francesca didn't accuse him of anything. Instead, she observed, and she recorded. Her surgery consultation was scheduled 2 weeks after the diagnosis. Dr. Bennett explained the procedure in careful detail. The operation would remove the affected tissue and determine whether the cancer had spread. Recovery would require several weeks. Chemotherapy would follow. Francesca listened calmly. She wrote down the key points in her notebook: dates, medication instructions, follow-up appointments. The doctor asked again if she had someone at home to help during recovery. "Yes," Francesca answered. "My husband." The words felt heavier this time. That evening, Francesca placed the surgery date on the family calendar hanging in the kitchen. 3 weeks away. Dylan stood nearby, scrolling through emails on his phone. "I'll need someone to stay with Ethan the first few days," Francesca said quietly. Dylan nodded without looking up. Maybe Rachel can help. Rachel Kim had been Francesca's colleague years earlier, before Ethan was born. They remained close friends. "I'll ask her," Francesca said. Dylan placed his phone down for a moment. "How long will you be in the hospital? 2 nights, probably?" He nodded again. Then he picked up his phone. The conversation ended there. Francesca didn't press further. She had learned long ago that forcing conversations rarely produced honesty. People revealed themselves more clearly through patterns. Over the next 2 weeks, those patterns became easier to see. Dylan began spending more nights in Chicago. At first, he explained it as convenience. Late meetings, early client calls. But soon the explanations stopped entirely. One evening, Francesca found his overnight bag, already packed near the door. "You're staying in the city again?" she asked. Dylan tightened his jacket. "Just easier with work right now." Francesca nodded. She didn't ask anything else. After he left, she opened her notebook. She wrote the date, then a short sentence. "Dylan staying in Chicago again." No discussion. The entry took only a few seconds. But it joined dozens of other notes, forming a quiet timeline of events. Meanwhile, Ethan noticed the changes in ways adults sometimes overlooked. One night, as Francesca tucked him into bed, he asked the question she had been expecting. "Why does Dad sleep at the office now?" Francesca smoothed the blanket over his shoulders. "He's busy with work." Ethan frowned slightly. "Will he be here when you go to the hospital?" Francesca paused. "I think so," she said gently. Ethan seemed satisfied with the answer. Children trusted simple promises. Francesca turned off the bedroom light and closed the door softly. The night before the surgery, Dylan returned home earlier than usual. He arrived just after dinner. Francesca was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the hospital paperwork. Dylan poured himself a glass of water and sat across from her. "You're all set for tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Dylan cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about things." Francesca looked up. "What things?" "The situation," he said carefully. "The treatment, the recovery, everything." Francesca waited. Dylan leaned back in his chair. "I don't think I'm equipped to handle this." The sentence landed quietly in the room. Not shouted, not emotional, just stated. Francesca's expression did not change. "What do you mean?" she asked. Dylan rubbed his forehead. "This isn't the life I planned, Francesca." She studied him. "You planned illness." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Dylan exhaled slowly. "I've worked too hard building the company. Everything is expanding right now. Investors are watching. Clients are watching." He gestured toward the medical folder. "This changes everything." Francesca remained silent. Dylan continued. I can't run a growing company while managing hospital visits and chemotherapy schedules. The words were calm, measured, almost rehearsed. Francesca noticed that. You're saying you don't want to help? She said quietly. Dylan shifted uncomfortably. I'm saying I need space. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. Francesca folded her hands on the table. Space from what? From all of this. He gestured again toward the folder. The illness, the uncertainty. Francesca looked at him steadily, and Ethan Dillon hesitated. That's not what I'm saying. But it was exactly what he was saying, even if he hadn't admitted it fully yet. Dillon stood up and walked toward the counter. I found an apartment downtown, he said. Francesca absorbed the words. You already found it, yes. When a few weeks ago, so he had been planning this, while she was scheduling surgeries, while she was writing treatment timelines, while Ethan was asking if his father would be home. Francesca did not raise her voice. Are you leaving tonight? She asked. Dylan nodded once. It's temporary. Temporary. Francesca recognized the word immediately. Temporary was the kind of language people used when they wanted distance without responsibility. Dylan walked toward the hallway. His overnight bag was already waiting. Ethan's bedroom door remained closed. The child inside was asleep. Dylan paused near the door. Francesca? She looked at him. This isn't personal. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Then Francesca nodded slightly. Of course it is, she said. But she said it without anger, without accusation, just truth. Dylan left 10 minutes later. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the quiet house. Francesca sat alone at the kitchen table. The hospital paperwork remained spread in front of her. For several minutes, she simply listened to the silence. Then she reached for her notebook. She wrote the date carefully. Below it, she added a short entry. Dylan moved to Chicago apartment tonight. Stated he needs space from illness. She closed the notebook, placed it beside the medical folder. And then she stood up and turned off the kitchen light. Tomorrow, she would go to the hospital. Tomorrow, the fight for her life would begin. But even now, before the surgery, Francesca understood something with complete clarity. Her husband had already left the battlefield. What he did not understand yet was that Francesca had not stopped paying attention, not to his words, not to his decisions, and not to the small financial changes that had quietly begun appearing in their shared accounts. Because while Dylan believed he was escaping a burden, he was also leaving behind a record. One that Francesca was already documenting line by line. Francesca's surgery took place on a cold morning in early December. The hospital corridors were quiet at that hour, filled with the soft sounds of rolling equipment and low conversations between nurses preparing for the day. Rachel Kim arrived before sunrise. She had insisted on driving Francesca to the hospital when it became clear Dylan would not be there. Rachel didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. Some things were obvious. When Francesca stepped out of the car, Rachel placed a hand on her shoulder. You ready? She asked gently. Francesca nodded. As ready as I can be. Rachel stayed with her through the preoperative check-in. Forms, insurance confirmations, consent documents. Francesca read each page carefully before signing. Even now, even on a morning like this, she refused to rush through important details. Habits did not disappear simply because life became difficult. A nurse eventually called her name. Rachel stood. I'll be here when you wake up, she said. Francesca offered a small smile. I know. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet understanding between two people who trusted each other. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours. Rachel spent that time in the waiting room reading the same magazine page repeatedly without remembering a single word. When Dr. Bennett finally appeared, Rachel stood quickly. How did it go? Dr. Bennett removed her surgical cap and spoke with careful reassurance. The procedure went well. We removed the affected tissue and preliminary indicators suggest we caught it before it spread extensively. Francesca will still need chemotherapy, but the prognosis is encouraging. Rachel exhaled slowly. Can I see her in a little while? The doctor said. Francesca woke up later that afternoon in a recovery room filled with soft beeping machines. Her body felt heavy. Every movement carried a dull ache. But the first thing she noticed was Rachel sitting beside the bed. "You're back," Rachel said with a tired smile. Francesca's voice was weak but steady. "How long? 4 hours?" Francesca nodded faintly. Rachel hesitated for a moment before asking the question she already knew the answer to. Did Dylan call? Francesca looked at the ceiling for a second. Then she shook her head. No. Rachel didn't say anything else. Some absences spoke loudly enough without commentary. Francesca spent 2 nights in the hospital. Rachel helped coordinate Ethan's schedule during that time, arranging school pickups and meals. Dylan never visited. On the second evening, he sent a short message. "Hope surgery went okay." Francesca read the message without reacting. Then she placed the phone back on the bedside table. She did not reply. When she was discharged, Rachel drove her back to the house in Naperville. The winter air had grown colder. Snow dusted the sidewalks and rooftops. Ethan ran toward the door the moment they arrived. "Mom." He stopped abruptly when he saw the bandages and the slow way Francesca moved. "Are you hurt?" Francesca knelt carefully despite the pain and hugged him. "I'm healing," she said. Ethan accepted that answer. Children often accepted explanations that adults would question. Life settled into a fragile routine during the weeks that followed. Francesca moved slowly through the house, recovering from surgery. Rachel stopped by often. Mrs. Eleanor Price, the elderly neighbor next door, began bringing over homemade soup. Ethan learned to help in small ways. He carried laundry baskets. He reminded Francesca when it was time for medication. But while Francesca's physical recovery progressed, another story was unfolding beyond the quiet streets of Naperville. Dylan's life in Chicago had begun expanding in ways he had not bothered to hide. At first, the information reached Francesca through indirect channels. A message from an old acquaintance. A passing comment from someone who had attended a business event. Then, one afternoon, Rachel arrived at the house holding her phone. "You should probably see this," she said carefully. Francesca looked up from the couch. Rachel hesitated before handing her the screen. The image displayed a photograph from a corporate fundraising event in downtown Chicago. A banner behind the stage read "Midwest Logistics Leadership." Gala Dylan stood near the center of the photo wearing a dark suit. Beside him was a woman Francesca recognized immediately. Vanessa Carter. Vanessa worked as a public relations consultant who had been hired by Holloway Logistics the previous year. In the photo, she stood very close to Dylan. Too close for a casual business relationship. Francesca studied the image for several seconds. "What else did you hear?" she asked quietly. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "Some people at the event were asking about you," and Rachel hesitated again. "Dylan told them you weren't doing well." Francesca looked up slowly. "What does that mean?" Rachel exhaled. "He said the illness had made things complicated, that you were struggling emotionally." The sentence lingered in the air. Francesca returned her gaze to the photograph. In the background of the image, Dylan appeared relaxed, confident, unburdened, as if nothing in his life required explanation. Rachel sat down across from her. "I'm sorry," she said. Francesca placed the phone on the table. "It's fine." But the words were not spoken with indifference. They were spoken with clarity. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to pretend this doesn't hurt." Francesca shook her head. "I'm not pretending." "Then why are you so calm?" Francesca looked toward the window. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Slow, steady. "Because anger doesn't change facts," she said. Rachel frowned slightly. "What facts?" Francesca reached toward the coffee table where her notebook rested. She opened it to a new page. At the top, she wrote the date. Then she added several short lines. Corporate event Dylan with Vanessa Carter. Statement reported Francesca emotionally unstable. She closed the notebook. Rachel watched her. "You're writing it down?" "Yes." Why? Francesca looked at her friend. "Because memory fades," she said calmly. "But records don't." Rachel studied her expression. For the first time since the diagnosis, she began to understand something important. Francesca wasn't ignoring what Dylan was doing. She was documenting it. That evening after Rachel left, Francesca checked her voicemail before going to bed. One new message appeared. Dylan's voice filled the quiet room. "Francesca, I heard the surgery went okay. I'm glad you're recovering. Listen, things are really busy here right now, and I don't want any misunderstandings about the company affecting my work. It's better if we keep some distance until everything settles down." The message ended. Francesca replayed it once. Then she connected her phone to her laptop. She saved the audio file in a folder labeled Simply Records. She added the date. Then she closed the computer. Upstairs, Ethan was already asleep. The house was quiet again. Francesca turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the darkness. Dylan believed the story he was telling the world would eventually replace the truth. He believed time erased inconvenient details. What he did not realize was that Francesca was not arguing with him. She was building a record. And records, when assembled carefully enough, had a way of outlasting lies. Chemotherapy began 6 weeks after Francesca's surgery. The treatment center at Northwestern was quiet in a different way than the surgical wing. There were no urgent footsteps or rushing nurses. Instead, there were rows of reclining chairs, IV poles, and patients sitting in silence with blankets draped across their laps. It was a room where time slowed down. Francesca arrived early on her first day of treatment. Rachel drove her again. Snow still lined the streets of Naperville, pushed into gray piles along the sidewalks. Inside the treatment center, a nurse named Angela Ruiz explained the process carefully. "Each session will take several hours," Angela said. "You may feel tired afterward. Some patients experience nausea or headaches. Everyone reacts differently." Francesca nodded. She had already written most of this information in her notebook during the consultation. Angela inserted the IV line gently into Francesca's arm. "If you feel anything unusual, just tell me." "I will," Francesca said. Rachel sat beside her during the first hour. They talked quietly about ordinary things: Ethan's school, Rachel's new project at work, a bakery that had opened downtown. Neither of them mentioned Dylan. Eventually, the medication began flowing through the IV. A cool sensation spread slowly through Francesca's arm, then fatigue, then a strange heaviness behind her eyes. Rachel noticed immediately. "You okay?" she asked. Francesca nodded. "Just tired." The treatments repeated every few weeks. Each session followed the same pattern. Rachel drove her when possible. Sometimes Mrs. Eleanor Price watched Ethan. Sometimes Francesca managed the drive herself, gripping the steering wheel carefully while her body fought waves of exhaustion. The side effects grew stronger as the months passed. Nausea in the mornings, headaches that lingered for hours, and eventually the moment every chemotherapy patient expected but still dreaded: hair loss. Francesca noticed the first strands on her pillow one morning in early February. She stared at them quietly for several seconds. Then she walked to the bathroom and examined her reflection in the mirror. There was no panic, just recognition. By the end of the week, the thinning patches had become impossible to ignore. Rachel came over that Saturday afternoon carrying groceries. Francesca greeted her at the door wearing a scarf. Rachel stopped when she saw her. "You don't have to hide it," she said softly. Francesca smiled slightly. "I'm not hiding it." Rachel tilted her head. "Then why the scarf?" Francesca shrugged gently. "Ethan isn't ready to see it yet." Rachel didn't argue. Instead, she helped unpack the groceries. That evening, after Ethan went to bed, Francesca walked into the bathroom again. This time, she picked up a pair of clippers. The buzzing sound filled the quiet house. Within minutes, the remaining hair fell away. Francesca studied the mirror once more. Her face looked different now, sharper, more fragile. But her eyes remained steady. She wrapped the scarf around her head again and turned off the light. Downstairs, her laptop waited on the kitchen table. Work had slowly returned to her life in small pieces, not with Holloway Logistics. That door had closed. But Rachel had introduced her to a consulting firm called Midwest Supply Consulting. The company handled operational troubleshooting for small logistics businesses. They occasionally needed help reviewing freight schedules or compliance documents. Francesca accepted small assignments she could complete from home. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept her mind engaged, and it paid enough to cover expenses Dylan had quietly stopped contributing toward. The financial shift had occurred gradually. First, Dylan stopped transferring money into their joint account. Then he moved several company-related payments into accounts Francesca could no longer access. She noticed immediately. Francesca logged into the bank portal one evening and studied the transaction history carefully. Several transfers had occurred within a 2-week period, large ones. She opened her notebook. At the top of a new page, she wrote, "Joint account transfers February." Then she recorded the amounts, dates, destination accounts. Afterward, she opened her laptop and downloaded the bank statements. The files joined the growing folder labeled Records. Meanwhile, Dylan's life in Chicago appeared to be moving in the opposite direction. His company continued expanding. Local business blogs occasionally mentioned Holloway Logistics securing new contracts. Sometimes photographs from industry events appeared online. In nearly all of them, Vanessa Carter stood somewhere nearby. Francesca rarely looked at those photos for long. They offered no new information, but she saved them anyway. Evidence she believed did not need emotional interpretation. It simply needed preservation. One afternoon during a chemotherapy session, Francesca received another voicemail from Dylan. She listened to it later that evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep. His voice sounded rushed. "Francesca, I need to clarify something. If anyone contacts you about the company, it's best if you refer them to the office. Some investors are asking questions, and I don't want confusion about who's responsible for what." The message ended there. Francesca replayed it once. Then she saved the file. Another entry appeared in the records folder. Another note went into her notebook. Voicemail Dylan referencing investor questions. Francesca didn't know yet what questions those investors were asking. But the detail mattered. Questions meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant pressure. And pressure had a way of exposing weak structures. That night, Ethan wandered downstairs after a bad dream. He climbed onto the couch beside Francesca while she worked on her laptop. "Mom." "Yes, are you still sick?" Francesca closed the computer gently. "I'm getting better." Ethan studied the scarf around her head. "Will your hair come back?" "Yes, when soon." He seemed satisfied with that answer. Children rarely needed precise timelines. Ethan leaned against her shoulder. "Dad said he's busy with work." Francesca nodded slowly. "I know. Will he come back when you're better?" Francesca looked toward the dark window across the room. Snowflakes drifted through the streetlight outside. "I don't know," she said. Ethan accepted the uncertainty more easily than most adults would have. Within minutes, he had fallen asleep against her arm. Francesca sat there quietly for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing, watching the snow outside. Life had become smaller, simpler. Hospital visits, consulting assignments, homework with Ethan, and documentation, always documentation. Because while Francesca focused on survival day by day, she also understood something Dylan did not. The story he was telling the world required people to forget details. But Francesca had built her life around remembering them. Every email, every transfer, every message, every absence. And over time, those details were beginning to form a pattern. A pattern that would eventually reach far beyond the quiet living room in Naperville. A pattern that one day would arrive in a place Dylan never expected. A boardroom, a table, and a set of documents no one would be able to ignore. Time did not pass dramatically for Francesca Holloway. It passed quietly, in hospital visits that slowly became less frequent, in mornings when she woke up with a little more strength than the week before, in the gradual return of small routines that illness had interrupted. By the end of the first year after surgery, the chemotherapy treatments were complete. The final appointment at Northwestern arrived on a cool spring morning. Dr. Laura Bennett reviewed the latest scans carefully before speaking. "The treatment worked well," she said. "There's no sign of active cancer right now. We'll continue monitoring every few months, but this is the outcome we hoped for." Francesca nodded slowly. Relief did not arrive as a burst of emotion. It arrived as a quiet release of tension she had been carrying for months. "Thank you," she said. Dr. Bennett smiled gently. "You did the hard part." Francesca left the hospital that day without the familiar folder of treatment instructions. For the first time in months, there were no chemotherapy appointments on her calendar. Life did not suddenly become easy. But it became possible again. Ethan was now 6 years old enough to notice that the house felt calmer, old enough to understand that his mother was getting stronger. The scarf disappeared gradually. Short strands of dark hair began returning. Ethan celebrated that change with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a child. "Your hair is coming back," he said one morning at breakfast. Francesca smiled. "Yes, it is." Meanwhile, the consulting work Rachel had introduced her to continued expanding. At Midwest Supply Consulting, Francesca had quickly earned a reputation for something many businesses valued more than charisma: accuracy. She reviewed freight contracts with patience. She traced shipment discrepancies others overlooked. She noticed small compliance risks before they became expensive mistakes. Her reports were clear, precise, unemotional. Clients trusted that kind of work. Within 2 years, the consulting assignments became steady. Within 4 years, Francesca had become one of the firm's most reliable analysts. She worked mostly from home, but occasionally traveled to Chicago for meetings. Ethan often sat at the kitchen table again while she worked, just like he had when he was younger. Only now, the toy trucks had been replaced by homework assignments and science projects. One evening, while reviewing a logistics report, Francesca paused at a familiar pattern of numbers. The client she was analyzing had expanded too quickly. Warehouse leases, truck acquisitions, credit lines, all arranged in a structure that looked impressive from the outside but carried hidden strain underneath. Francesca corrected the model, added a note: "Rapid expansion without capital stabilization increases collapse risk." She sent the report back to the consulting firm. The observation was simple, but it reminded her of something she had seen before. Not in a consulting file, in a company she knew very well. Holloway Logistics. Francesca rarely thought about Dylan directly anymore. Life had reorganized itself around different priorities: Ethan's school, her work, regular health monitoring. But the business world in Chicago was small. News about companies circulated easily, and Holloway Logistics appeared often. Dylan had expanded aggressively. The company now operated across several Midwestern states. New warehouses, new contracts, new equipment purchases. From the outside, it looked like success. But the financial structure behind that success told a different story. Francesca saw glimpses of it in public filings and industry reports. Debt ratios rising, credit exposure widening, operational costs increasing faster than revenue. None of those things guaranteed failure. But together, they created vulnerability. One afternoon, nearly 6 years after the day Dylan left the house in Naperville, Francesca received an email from Rachel. The subject line was simple: "Have you seen this?" Attached was a link to a regional business article. Francesca opened it. The headline read, "Holloway Logistics secures major distribution contract with Midwest retail chain." The article included a photograph from the contract announcement. Dylan stood at the center of the image, older now, more polished. Beside him stood Vanessa Carter, still working as the company's public relations consultant. Francesca read the article carefully. Near the bottom, a short paragraph mentioned financing. The expansion was supported by a significant credit agreement with Great Lakes Capital Bank. Francesca leaned back slightly in her chair. Large expansion loans often came with strict oversight. Covenants, reporting requirements, operational restrictions. Companies growing too quickly sometimes found themselves trapped inside those agreements. She closed the article. It was interesting information, nothing more. But later that week, another piece of news appeared. This time, it arrived through a professional contact at the consulting firm. During a conference call, one of the firm's senior analysts mentioned an upcoming restructuring project. A logistics company in Chicago might need operational review soon, the analyst said. Which company? Someone asked. Holloway Logistics. Francesca did not react outwardly. She simply continued typing notes from the meeting. The analyst continued. They expanded aggressively over the last few years. Now lenders want tighter reporting. Another consultant laughed lightly. That's what happens when founders grow too fast. Francesca remained silent. But that evening, after the call ended, she opened a new document on her laptop. She began reviewing publicly available corporate filings connected to Holloway Logistics. Old habits returned quickly. Corporate registration records, ownership disclosures, early funding documents. Francesca had not examined these files in years. But something about the company's financial trajectory made her curious. As she reviewed the documents, one familiar detail appeared again. A detail that had existed since the company's earliest days. The original startup capital. Some of it had come from a joint financial account shared by Dylan and Francesca during the first year of the company. At the time, it had seemed unimportant. Married couples often supported each other financially when starting businesses. But the document showed something else. The capital had been used to purchase the company's earliest shares. Shares that had later formed the foundation for Dylan's controlling ownership. Francesca paused. She opened her old digital folders. Inside records, the files she had saved years earlier still remained. Bank statements, transaction histories, emails, voicemail files. Everything dated, everything preserved. Francesca compared the documents carefully. Numbers aligned, dates aligned. And slowly, a realization formed. The original financial structure of Holloway Logistics contained a legal vulnerability, one that Dylan had never corrected. Perhaps he had assumed the past would remain quiet. Perhaps he believed Francesca would never revisit it. But Francesca had spent 6 years building a life based on patience. And patience allowed people to see patterns others missed. She closed the documents and leaned back in her chair. Across the kitchen table, Ethan was finishing a math worksheet. "How was your homework?" she asked. "Easy," he said. Francesca smiled. "Good." She closed the laptop. Not because she had finished thinking about the discovery, but because she understood something important. Information was powerful only when handled carefully. And the detail she had just uncovered was not something to rush. It was something to verify, to examine, to understand completely. Because if her interpretation was correct, then the company Dylan believed he controlled absolutely had been built on a structure that included her. Legally, financially, and historically, a structure that had never been fully untangled. Francesca did not feel excitement or revenge. She felt something much quieter, clarity. And clarity, she knew, was the first step toward understanding what the next 6 years of silence might eventually reveal. Francesca did not act immediately after discovering the detail in the early ownership records. Acting too quickly often led to mistakes. Instead, she did what she had always done best. She verified. Over the next several weeks, she returned to the documents again and again in the evenings, after Ethan finished his homework and the house grew quiet. Corporate filings, bank records, old emails she had archived years earlier. Everything was still there. Francesca had never deleted anything connected to the early years of Holloway Logistics. At the time, it had been a simple habit saving files in organized folders. Now, those folders had become something else. A timeline. She began reconstructing the earliest financial structure of the company. The first trucks buy, the first warehouse lease, the initial capital deposits. During the first year of Holloway Logistics, Dylan had struggled to secure financing. The company had no credit history yet, and lenders were cautious. Francesca remembered those months clearly. They had sat together at the kitchen table night after night reviewing spreadsheets. At one point, Dylan needed immediate cash to secure a delivery contract that could make or break the company's early momentum. The money had come from their joint account. Savings. Some of it from Dylan's previous work. Some from Francesca's own savings before Ethan was born. At the time, neither of them had treated the transfer as unusual. They were married. They were building something together. But now, 6 years later, Francesca noticed something that had never been formally addressed. The capital from that joint account had been used to purchase the company's earliest equity shares. Yet, in the corporate filings, those shares were recorded solely under Dylan's name. Francesca leaned back in her chair as she studied the documents. It might have been an oversight, or it might have been deliberate. Either way, it created a complicated legal question. She closed the file and opened another. The bank statement from that same year. The transaction appeared clearly. A transfer from the joint account to the newly formed Holloway Logistics business account. Francesca compared the date with the company's share allocation record. They matched. Her gaze moved slowly across the screen. Evidence did not shout. It simply existed. The next question was more important. What did the law say about it? Francesca didn't guess. Guessing had never been her method. Instead, she scheduled a meeting with someone who understood corporate law far better than she did. The appointment took place 2 weeks later in a quiet office building in downtown Chicago. The law firm's name was modestly displayed in polished steel letters beside the elevator. Mercer and Daily Corporate Litigation. Francesca arrived 10 minutes early. She carried a slim folder containing only a small portion of the documents she had reviewed. Enough to ask a question. Not enough to reveal everything. The attorney who greeted her introduced himself with a firm handshake. Daniel Mercer. Francesca nodded politely. Francesca Holloway. Mercer led her into a conference room with large windows overlooking the Chicago River. Once they were seated, he folded his hands on the table. What can I help you with? Francesca placed the folder in front of him. I have a question about corporate ownership. Mercer opened the folder and began reviewing the first document. It was one of the early bank statements, then the share allocation filing. He read quietly for several minutes. Finally, he looked up. Are you connected to Holloway Logistics? Francesca answered calmly. My husband founded the company. Mercer's expression shifted slightly. Your husband? Yes. And these funds, he said, tapping the bank statement, came from a joint marital account. Yes. Mercer leaned back slightly. How long ago was this? About 8 years. And the shares were recorded entirely under his name, yes. Mercer studied the documents again. He spoke carefully. This situation can become complicated depending on several factors. What factors state marital property law? The company's operating agreement. Whether the contribution was documented as a loan or an equity purchase. Francesca nodded. There was no loan agreement. Mercer tapped the page again. Then the question becomes whether the original capital contribution created a marital ownership interest. Francesca said nothing. Mercer continued. In many cases, funds from a joint marital account used to establish corporate equity can create shared ownership rights, even if the shares were recorded under only one spouse. He looked at her directly, especially if there was no written agreement stating otherwise. Francesca absorbed the words without visible reaction. What would need to happen to confirm that, she asked? Mercer slid the documents back toward her. I would need to review the full corporate formation records, operating agreements, share issuance documentation, tax filings, and ideally the entire financial timeline. Francesca closed the folder slowly. I have those? Mercer raised an eyebrow. You have all of them? Francesca nodded. I keep records. Mercer smiled faintly. That's usually helpful. There was a brief pause before he spoke again. One more question, Mrs. Holloway. Yes. Why are you asking about this now? Francesca looked toward the window for a moment. The Chicago River moved slowly below the building. I wanted to understand whether the original ownership structure was accurate. Mercer considered her answer carefully, and if it wasn't, Francesca returned her gaze to him. Then the records should reflect the truth. Mercer studied her expression. There was no anger in her voice, no urgency, just quiet certainty. He leaned forward slightly. If what these documents suggest is correct, the implications could be significant. How significant, Mercer chose his words carefully. If your contribution created a legal ownership interest that was never formally acknowledged, then the current equity structure of Holloway Logistics may not be accurate. Francesca nodded slowly. And that would affect the company today, yes. Mercer closed the folder. In a company that size, correcting ownership percentages could have substantial consequences. Francesca stood. Thank you for explaining. Mercer stood as well. If you decide to pursue this further, bring the complete records. I'll review everything. Francesca shook his hand. I will. Outside the building, the afternoon traffic moved steadily along Wacker Drive. Francesca walked toward the train station without rushing. Nothing had been decided yet. Nothing had been filed. But something had changed. For 6 years, Francesca had been documenting the past without knowing whether those records would ever matter. Now she understood they might. Because while Dylan had been expanding Holloway Logistics, he had been doing so on top of a foundation that included someone he believed had disappeared from the story. Francesca Holloway. And the document sitting quietly in her home office suggested that the story Dylan had been telling about ownership was not the full one. Francesca did not return to Daniel Mercer's office immediately. Even after their first meeting, she allowed several weeks to pass. The discovery she had made was important, but importance alone did not require speed. In fact, in matters involving law and corporate ownership, speed often created problems. Accuracy mattered more. During those weeks, Francesca continued her normal routine. Morning breakfasts with Ethan, consulting reports for Midwest Supply Consulting, regular health checkups every 3 months at Northwestern. Life on the surface remained steady. But each evening after Ethan finished his homework and went upstairs, Francesca returned to the records. Boxes she had not opened in years came down from the closet shelves in her home office. Inside were the earliest remnants of Holloway Logistics, old binders, USB drives, printed contracts, handwritten notebooks. When Francesca had first started helping Dylan build the company, she had organized everything by habit. At the time, it had simply been a way to keep things manageable. Now, it had become something much larger, a complete history. She worked slowly, one folder at a time. Every document was scanned into her computer and sorted into categories. Corporate formation, capital, contributions, contracts, communications. Financial transfers. The process took nearly 3 weeks. Sometimes Rachel stopped by and found Francesca surrounded by papers across the dining table. Rachel looked at the growing stacks one evening and raised an eyebrow. You're building an archive. Francesca smiled faintly. I already had one. Rachel leaned against the counter. And Dylan has no idea. Francesca shook her head. He never asked. Rachel laughed quietly. That sounds like Dylan. Francesca didn't respond. She simply continued scanning documents. By the time the process was finished, the digital folder labeled Records had grown into a carefully organized database. There were email threads dating back nearly a decade, early vendor agreements, warehouse lease drafts, and most importantly, the financial documentation showing exactly how the company's original capital had been structured. Francesca reviewed the timeline again. The transfer from the joint account, the deposit into the new business account, the issuance of equity shares, each step clearly connected to the next. She printed several key documents and placed them in a new folder. 2 days later, she returned to Daniel Mercer's office. This time, the folder she carried was thicker. Mercer greeted her with a nod as she entered the conference room. "I was wondering if you'd come back," he said. Francesca placed the folder on the table. "I brought the full records." Mercer opened the folder and began reading. The room became quiet, except for the soft turning of pages. Minutes passed, then more. Mercer occasionally stopped to examine a date more closely or compare two documents. Francesca did not interrupt. She had spent years learning that patience often revealed more than conversation. Finally, Mercer leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said slowly, "that's quite thorough." Francesca nodded. "I prefer complete records." Mercer tapped the stack lightly. "These documents confirm something important." "What is that?" "The original capital used to form Holloway Logistics came from a marital account shared equally between you and your husband." "Yes." "And there was never any formal agreement stating that the contribution belonged solely to Dylan Numbers?" Mercer nodded. "That means the funds used to purchase the company's original shares were jointly owned at the time they were invested." Francesca waited. Mercer continued. "In many jurisdictions, including Illinois, that can establish a marital property interest in the resulting equity." Francesca's expression remained calm. "So the shares should have been partially mine?" "Potentially, yes." Mercer slid one of the documents toward her. "This filing from the company's formation year shows the shares allocated entirely to Dylan. But there's no documentation explaining why the marital funds used to purchase them were excluded from shared ownership." Francesca studied the page. "Is that unusual?" "It's not unheard of," Mercer said. "But when it happens, it often becomes a legal issue later." "How much later?" Mercer gave a small smile. "Sometimes many years later." Francesca nodded slowly. Mercer closed the folder. "There's something else you should know." "What is it?" He reached for another document in the stack. "This company has expanded significantly since its formation." "Yes, that means the value of those original shares has increased dramatically." Francesca remained silent. Mercer looked at her directly. "If a court determines that you were entitled to a portion of those shares from the beginning, the ownership structure of the entire company could change." Francesca absorbed the statement without visible reaction. "How would that happen?" Mercer leaned forward slightly. "There are several possible paths." He counted them quietly. "Negotiated settlement, equity correction through corporate restructuring, or if necessary, litigation." Francesca considered the options. "What would you recommend?" Mercer paused. "That depends on your objective." "My objective?" "Yes," he said. "Do you want compensation? Do you want acknowledgement? Or do you want control?" The room fell silent for a moment. Francesca looked down at the folder. Inside were years of documentation, years of silence, years of careful observation. Finally, she answered, "I want the records to reflect the truth." Mercer studied her carefully. "That may lead to more than acknowledgement." "I understand." Mercer nodded slowly. "Then the next step is verification." "Verification, yes. We'll obtain the company's current shareholder structure and financial filings. If the numbers align the way I suspect, we can establish exactly how much ownership should have existed from the beginning." Francesca nodded. "How long will that take?" "A few weeks." Mercer stood and extended his hand. "I'll begin the review immediately." Francesca shook his hand. "Thank you." As she left the office building and stepped back onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, Francesca did not feel excitement. She did not feel anger either. What she felt was something quieter. Momentum. For years, Dylan had believed that time erased the past. That once he left Naperville, the early days of the company had become irrelevant. But businesses were not built on stories alone. They were built on contracts, on transfers, on signatures, and on records. Francesca had preserved every one of those things. Now those records were beginning to move beyond her quiet office at home. They were entering legal review, corporate analysis, financial examination. And once that process began, it would eventually lead somewhere Dylan had never expected. Back to the beginning, back to the first transaction, back to the moment when the company he believed he owned completely had actually been built on something shared, something he had never formally separated, and something Francesca Holloway had finally decided to understand completely. The review Daniel Mercer promised did not happen overnight. Corporate structures, especially those that had evolved over nearly a decade, required patience to unravel. Shares changed hands. Debt reshaped ownership layers. Investors introduced new agreements that sometimes complicated the earliest foundations of a company. But Mercer approached the process the way Francesca approached everything else. Methodically. Within 3 weeks, he had obtained the public filings connected to Holloway Logistics. Within 5 weeks, he had secured additional financial disclosures tied to the company's lending agreements with Great Lakes Capital Bank. By the time Francesca returned to his office for their next meeting, the conference table was covered with organized stacks of documents. Mercer gestured toward the chair across from him. "You may want to sit for this." Francesca did. Mercer slid a printed chart across the table. "This," he said, "is the current ownership structure of Holloway Logistics." The chart showed the company's equity distribution. Dylan Holloway remained the controlling shareholder. Several smaller investors held minority stakes, and a portion of the company had been pledged as collateral in financing agreements with the bank. Francesca studied the chart quietly. Mercer continued. "On the surface, everything appears straightforward." He tapped the bottom section of the page. "But when we trace ownership back to the beginning, the structure becomes more complicated." He reached for another document. This is the original share issuance from the company's formation year. Francesca recognized it immediately. She had reviewed it herself many times. Mercer placed the bank transfer record beside it. "The funds used to purchase these shares came from your joint marital account." "Yes." Mercer nodded. "That means the original equity should have reflected joint ownership unless there was a written agreement stating otherwise. There wasn't." Mercer looked at her. "I confirmed that." Francesca folded her hands on the table. "What does that mean now?" Mercer leaned back slightly. "It means that, legally speaking, the company's foundational equity may have been misallocated from the start." He paused before continuing. "And because that initial equity served as the base for every later share issuance, correcting it today could affect the entire structure." Francesca absorbed the statement slowly. "How large of a correction?" Mercer turned another page toward her. "If the initial capital contribution had been properly recognized, you would likely have owned approximately 40% of the company's earliest shares." Francesca said nothing. Mercer continued. "As the company expanded, Dylan issued additional shares to investors and lenders. Yes, but because your ownership was never formally recorded, those later issuances assumed Dylan held 100% of the original equity." Francesca followed his reasoning. "So every dilution calculation started from the wrong number." Mercer nodded. "Exactly." He slid a second chart across the table. This one looked different. If your original ownership had been recognized from the beginning, your current share percentage would likely be closer to 52%. Francesca looked down at the number. 52%. Mercer spoke carefully. "That would make you the majority shareholder." The room remained quiet. Outside the window, boats moved slowly along the Chicago River. Francesca lifted her eyes. "And Dylan, he would still hold significant shares," Mercer said. "But he would no longer control the company." Francesca sat silently for a moment. 6 years earlier, she had been sitting at a kitchen table in Naperville, recovering from surgery. Dylan had told her he needed space from her illness. Now the conversation unfolding in this conference room was about something entirely different. Ownership, authority, control. But Francesca's voice remained calm. What happens next? Mercer folded his hands. We have several options. Explain them. The first is a private negotiation. We present Dylan with the documentation and request voluntary correction of the share structure. Francesca considered that. And if he refuses, Mercer gave a small smile. Then we pursue legal action to correct the corporate records. How long would that take? Possibly months. Possibly longer. Francesca nodded. Mercer continued. There's another factor. What factor? He opened a new folder. Inside were financial reports from Holloway Logistics. Your husband's company is currently under significant financial pressure. Francesca glanced at the numbers. Debt obligations, loan covenants, operational costs. Mercer pointed to one line in particular. Great Lakes Capital Bank extended a large credit facility 2 years ago. Yes, that agreement includes strict financial oversight. If ownership disputes arise, the bank has the right to intervene. Francesca understood immediately, and they wouldn't want instability. Correct. Mercer closed the folder. That means Dylan may not have the luxury of ignoring this issue. Francesca leaned back slightly. For 6 years, he believed the company belonged entirely to him. Mercer nodded. And now? Now the records say something else. Francesca looked again at the charts on the table. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel revenge. What she felt was recognition. For years, she had simply preserved facts. Those facts had now become leverage. Mercer studied her expression. You're taking this calmly. Francesca met his gaze. Emotions don't change documents. Mercer smiled faintly. That's true. He gathered the charts into a single stack. If you're ready, the next step is to prepare formal documentation. Francesca nodded. What will that involve? We'll assemble a complete evidence package. He began listing the contents. Original bank transfers, corporate formation records, share issuance documentation, email correspondence, financial timelines. Francesca recognized nearly every item. I already have most of that. Mercer gestured toward her. I noticed. He placed the stack into a large folder. We'll submit a formal notice requesting correction of the company's ownership records. Francesca stood. And Dylan will receive that notice, yes. She considered that quietly. For years, Dylan had believed Francesca had disappeared into a life far sought away from his. Illness, recovery, single parenthood, a quiet consulting job. He had never asked what she had done with the time in between. He had never asked what she had been paying attention to. Now those years were about to appear again. Not as accusations, not as arguments, but as documentation. Francesca picked up her bag. When will you send it? Mercer glanced at the folder. Within a week. Francesca nodded. Good. As she left the office and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, the city felt unchanged. Cars moved through traffic. People crossed the street carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Somewhere in another office building across Chicago, Dylan Holloway was likely reviewing logistics reports or negotiating the next contract. He had no idea that the structure beneath his company had just shifted. Not publicly, not yet. But the process had begun. And once the documents Mercer was preparing reached the right desks, the quiet records Francesca had preserved for 6 years would become impossible to ignore. The formal notice left Daniel Mercer's office on a Monday morning. It did not arrive dramatically. No reporters, no public announcements. Just a carefully drafted legal document delivered through certified channels to the executive offices of Holloway Logistics Group in Chicago. Inside the envelope were several pages, a summary of findings, a request for correction of corporate ownership records, and a collection of supporting documentation tracing the company's original capital back to the joint marital account that Francesca Holloway and Dylan Holloway had once shared. Mercer understood something many lawyers learned early in their careers. Facts did not need to be loud to be powerful. They only needed to be precise. Across the city, the envelope arrived at Holloway Logistics headquarters just before noon. The building stood in Chicago's West Loop, a modern office space Dylan had proudly moved into during the company's expansion years. The receptionist, Olivia Grant, signed for the delivery without thinking much about it. Certified mail arrived frequently in growing companies. She placed the envelope with the rest of the executive correspondence and forwarded it upstairs. The package reached Dylan's office shortly after lunch. He had just returned from a meeting with 2 regional distribution partners. His desk was cluttered with contracts and financial reports when Olivia knocked gently on the door. "Delivery for you," she said. Dylan glanced up. "Thanks." He set the envelope aside while finishing an email. Several minutes passed before he finally opened it. The first page carried the letterhead of Mercer and Daily Corporate Litigation. Dylan frowned slightly. He did not recognize the firm immediately. But as he continued reading, the expression on his face slowly changed. The letter was direct, professional, carefully worded. It outlined the findings Mercer had discussed with Francesca, the use of marital funds in the original capitalization of Holloway Logistics, the absence of documentation transferring those funds into Dylan's sole ownership, and the resulting discrepancy in the company's share allocation. Dylan read the letter twice. Then he turned to the attached documents: bank records, corporate filings, share issuance summaries. Each page traced a path backward in time. Back to the earliest days of the company. Back to the kitchen table where Francesca had once sat reviewing contracts late at night. Back to the joint account he had nearly forgotten about. Dylan placed the papers on his desk and leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he reached for the phone. "Get Mark Sullivan in here," he told Olivia. Mark Sullivan, the company's chief financial officer, arrived 15 minutes later. Mark had joined Holloway Logistics during its 3rd year of growth and had helped manage its expansion through multiple states. He entered Dylan's office carrying a tablet and a cup of coffee. "What's up?" Dylan slid the documents across the desk. "Read this." Mark skimmed the first page. Then he slowed down. His eyes moved more carefully across the paragraphs. By the time he finished, his coffee sat forgotten in his hand. "Where did this come from?" Mark asked. "A law firm." Mark flipped through the attachments. "These records, they're from the company's 1st year." "Yes." Mark looked up. "You didn't mention this before." Dylan's voice was tight. "Because it wasn't relevant." Mark leaned forward. "Apparently it is now." Dylan stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. "This is ridiculous," he said. "That money came from our household. We were married." Mark nodded slowly, which is exactly the point they're making. Dylan turned back toward him. "So what? She wants money." Mark shook his head. "Not exactly." He pointed to the section Mercer had highlighted. "They're claiming the original shares should have been partially hers." Dylan stared at him. "That's impossible." Mark exhaled. "If the documentation checks out, it may not be." Dylan returned to his desk and grabbed the letter again. His eyes stopped on the projected share calculation Mercer had included. 52%. Dylan's jaw tightened. "That would make her the majority owner," he said. Mark nodded. "Yes." The room fell silent. Outside the window, trucks moved slowly through the industrial streets below. Finally, Dylan spoke again. "Call the company lawyers." Within an hour, Holloway Logistics' legal team had assembled in the conference room. 3 attorneys reviewed Mercer's letter carefully. One of them, Karen Whitfield, spoke first. "Have you seen these documents before?" Dylan shook his head. "Not like this." Karen tapped the bank transfer record. "This transaction is real, yes. And it came from a joint account with your wife, yes." Karen leaned back. "That complicates things." Dylan crossed his arms. "How if marital funds were used to purchase the company's founding equity? Your wife may have had a legal ownership interest from the beginning." Dylan's voice hardened. She never worked at the company. Karen didn't argue. That may not matter. She pointed to the corporate formation filing. This document allocates the shares entirely to you. But it doesn't explain why the marital contribution wasn't acknowledged. Another attorney spoke. If the claim proceeds to court, the ownership structure could be reevaluated. Dylan looked around the room. His company is worth tens of millions now. Karen nodded. That's why this matters. Mark Sullivan spoke carefully. There's another issue. Everyone turned toward him. Our credit agreement with Great Lakes Capital Bank includes a clause about ownership disputes. Karen's expression darkened slightly. Yes, it does. Dylan frowned. What clause? Mark answered quietly. If there's a significant legal challenge to the company's equity structure, the bank can demand immediate financial review. Karen finished the thought. And potentially freeze certain transactions until the matter is resolved. Dylan stared at the documents again. 6 years ago, he had walked out of a quiet house in Naperville, believing that chapter of his life was finished. He had assumed Francesca would remain exactly where he left her, recovering, struggling, disappearing quietly from the story of the company he had built. Now her name sat at the top of a legal document that threatened to rewrite the company's ownership. Dylan looked at Karen. What do we do? Karen closed the folder. We respond carefully. How we review every document they've provided. If their claim has merit, we may need to consider negotiation. Dylan's voice sharpened. You mean settlement? Karen didn't correct him. It's one possibility. Dylan looked down at the chart again. 52%. Majority ownership. For a moment the room felt smaller, because the woman he had once dismissed as a burden, the woman he had left behind during the worst months of her life, was now positioned to take control of the company he believed he owned completely. And the most unsettling part of the situation was not anger. It was the realization that she had not rushed into this. She had waited. She had documented. She had allowed the company to grow larger and more valuable, and only then had the records appeared, not as accusations, but as facts. The meeting was scheduled 3 weeks after the legal notice arrived. Not in a courtroom, not in public, but in a quiet conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown Chicago law office. A neutral location, the kind used when situations were serious enough to require lawyers, but not yet explosive enough to require judges. Francesca arrived 10 minutes early. She had chosen a simple dark suit and tied her now fully regrown hair neatly at the back. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance, nothing that asked for attention. Daniel Mercer walked beside her through the hallway. You understand how this will go, he said quietly. Francesca nodded. They'll try to minimize the claim first. Yes, and if that doesn't work, they'll negotiate. Mercer studied her expression. You're calm. Francesca looked toward the glass wall at the end of the corridor. I've had 6 years to think. They entered the conference room. On the other side of the table sat Dylan Holloway. Time had changed him slightly. The expensive suits were sharper now. The confidence was still there. But the relaxed certainty that once surrounded him had tightened into something more controlled. Beside him sat 2 attorneys from Holloway Logistics' legal team. Karen Whitfield was among them. Mark Sullivan, the company's CFO, sat quietly at the far end of the table. Dylan looked up when Francesca entered. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The last time they had seen each other in person had been nearly 6 years earlier in the kitchen of their house in Naperville. That conversation had ended with Dylan carrying an overnight bag toward the door. Now they were meeting again under very different circumstances. Mercer placed his folder on the table. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he said. Karen Whitfield nodded professionally. It's in everyone's interest to review the facts. Everyone sat. The room fell into the particular kind of silence that often precedes legal conversations. Mercer opened the folder. I'll begin with the documentation already provided. He slid several pages across the table. The original capitalization of Holloway Logistics occurred on March 14th, 8 years ago. Mark Sullivan glanced at the page. Yes, Mercer continued. The funds used to purchase the company's initial shares came from a joint marital account belonging to Dylan Holloway and Francesca Holloway. Karen Whitfield nodded slowly. We've confirmed the transfer. Mercer turned another page. At the time of the transaction, there was no written agreement stating that the capital belonged solely to Mr. Holloway. Karen folded her hands. That appears to be correct. Dylan spoke for the first time. This was a family decision. Francesca knew I was starting the company. Francesca's voice remained quiet. Yes. Dylan looked directly at her. And you never objected to how the shares were issued. Francesca met his gaze. I was never asked. The room became still again. Mercer continued before the conversation could drift. The issue is not whether Mrs. Holloway supported the company's creation. The issue is whether marital funds created a shared ownership interest that was never properly recorded. Karen Whitfield spoke carefully. We acknowledge that the original funding came from a joint account. Mercer nodded. Then we also acknowledge that the share allocation may not have reflected that. Karen paused before answering. That possibility exists. Mark Sullivan shifted slightly in his chair. Mercer placed another chart on the table. If the capital contribution had been properly recorded as marital equity, Mrs. Holloway's ownership percentage today would be approximately 52%. Dylan leaned forward. That's an assumption. Mercer slid the supporting calculations toward him. It's based on your own share dilution records. Dylan studied the numbers. Mark Sullivan had already seen them. His silence confirmed that the math was difficult to dispute. Karen Whitfield spoke again. Even if the claim has merit, there are practical considerations. Mercer raised an eyebrow. Such as the company has multiple investors now, she said. Correcting the ownership structure affects more than Mr. Holloway. Mercer nodded. That's true, Karen continued, which is why litigation would be extremely disruptive. Francesca spoke calmly. I'm not interested in disruption. Dylan looked at her sharply. Then what do you want? The question hung in the room. Francesca did not answer immediately. She looked down at the documents in front of her. Then she spoke. The records corrected. Nothing more. No demand for money. No raised voice. Just that. Dylan stared at her. That correction would give you majority ownership. Francesca nodded once. Yes. And you're asking me to just hand over control of the company I built. Mercer responded before Francesca needed to. The company was built with shared capital. Dylan shook his head. You never worked there. Francesca's expression did not change. I reviewed the contracts. I organized the vendors. I helped structure the first client agreements. Dylan's voice tightened. That wasn't the same as running the business. Francesca looked at him quietly. I didn't say it was. The calmness in her tone unsettled him more than anger would have. Mercer returned the conversation to the documents. Our proposal is simple. He placed a final paper on the table. The corporate records are corrected to reflect Mrs. Holloway's rightful share percentage. Karen Whitfield studied the page. And in return, Mercer answered. Mrs. Holloway has no intention of dismantling the company. Mark Sullivan looked up. That sentence mattered. Mercer continued. The goal is accurate ownership, not destruction. Dylan leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he spoke again, this time more slowly. You waited 6 years to do this. Francesca looked at him. No. I waited until I understood the records. Dylan studied her face. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was trying to understand the person sitting across from him rather than the story he had created about her. You could have come after the company earlier, he said. Francesca shook her head. Earlier, I was trying to survive. The words were quiet, but everyone in the room understood what they meant. Dylan looked down at the chart again. 52%. Majority ownership. Karen Whitfield closed the folder. We'll need time to review the proposal. Mercer nodded. That's reasonable. The meeting ended without raised voices. Without threats, just documents, numbers, and the slow recognition that the structure of Holloway Logistics had shifted in a way no one in the room could easily ignore. As Francesca stood and prepared to leave, Dylan spoke once more. Francesca. She paused. When did you start planning this? She looked at him for a moment. I didn't. Dylan frowned. Then how did we get here? Francesca picked up her bag by following the records. And with that, she walked out of the conference room. The board meeting took place 2 months after the negotiation session. By then, the situation had moved beyond private discussion between lawyers. Too many people had become involved. Investors, lenders, corporate advisors, and eventually the board of Holloway Logistics itself, Great Lakes Capital Bank, had also taken notice. When a company carries significant credit obligations, ownership disputes are not treated as personal matters. They become financial risks. The bank's representatives requested a formal review of the company's equity structure. Once that review began, the documentation Daniel Mercer had assembled could no longer remain a quiet legal curiosity. It became part of the company's official record. On a gray morning in early autumn, the board of Holloway Logistics gathered in the same conference room where Francesca Holloway now sat at the head of the long table. The room was filled with quiet tension. Board members reviewed the printed reports in front of them. Legal counsel sat along the side wall. Mark Sullivan occupied his usual seat near the middle of the table, though his expression carried a weight it had not held in previous years. Dylan Holloway entered last. He paused when he saw Francesca already seated at the head of the table. For a brief moment, the room felt suspended in time. 6 years earlier, he had watched her sitting quietly at a kitchen table while he explained why he needed distance from her illness. Now she occupied the seat traditionally reserved for the company's majority stakeholder. The shift was not symbolic. It was legal. Karen Whitfield stood and addressed the room. As you know, the ownership review requested by Great Lakes Capital Bank has now been completed. She placed a thick report on the table. Our firm, along with external auditors, has verified the documentation concerning the company's original capital contributions. Several board members turned pages carefully. Karen continued. The findings confirmed that the funds used to establish Holloway Logistics were drawn from a joint marital account belonging to Dylan Holloway and Francesca Holloway. A quiet murmur moved through the room. The early history of the company had rarely been discussed at the board level. For most investors, Holloway Logistics had simply appeared as a successful logistics firm with a confident founder. Karen turned another page. Because that initial capital was never formally separated into individual ownership, the resulting share allocation did not reflect the full legal ownership structure. She paused before delivering the final line. After correcting the equity calculations, Francesca Holloway holds a controlling interest in the company. The room became completely still. Some board members glanced at Dylan. Others looked toward Francesca. She remained calm. Hands folded on the table, expression steady. Mark Sullivan cleared his throat quietly. The recalculated share distribution has been included in the report. A chart appeared on the screen at the front of the room. The numbers were clear. Francesca Holloway, 52%. Dylan, a Holloway, 31%. Remaining shares distributed among investors and financial stakeholders. For the first time since the company's creation, Dylan Holloway no longer held control. One of the board members spoke first, Thomas Greer, a senior investor who had joined during the company's expansion years. This is a significant change. Karen Whitfield nodded. Yes. Thomas looked toward Francesca. Mrs. Holloway, do you intend to assume operational control of the company? Francesca answered calmly. No. That response created visible surprise around the table. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Then what is your intention? Francesca spoke with the same quiet clarity she had carried throughout the process. "I intend for the company to continue operating." Another board member asked. With Mr. Holloway still as CEO, Francesca looked toward Dylan. For a moment their eyes met. Then she returned her attention to the board. "That decision belongs to the board and the shareholders." The statement was simple, but everyone in the room understood its meaning. She had not come to dismantle the company. She had come to correct its foundation. Karen Whitfield resumed the meeting. With the ownership adjustment confirmed, the board must now formally recognize the updated share structure. The resolution was read aloud. The votes were recorded. One by one, board members approved the correction. The final vote was unanimous. When the process ended, the corporate secretary signed the document. The company's official records were updated. Francesca Holloway became the majority owner of Holloway Logistics. No applause followed, no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement that the structure of the company had changed. The meeting began to dissolve slowly. Board members gathered their papers. Lawyers exchanged brief conversations. Mark Sullivan remained seated for a moment longer. Finally, he looked toward Francesca. "I didn't see this coming," he admitted. Francesca nodded. Most people didn't. Mark studied her expression. "You could have done this years ago," Francesca answered simply. "Years ago, I was in chemotherapy." Mark looked down. There was nothing to add to that. Across the room, Dylan remained seated. He had not spoken since the vote. The man who had once controlled every major decision in the company now watched the boardroom empty without him. Francesca gathered her documents quietly. When she stood to leave, Dylan finally spoke. "Francesca," she paused, "did you ever plan to destroy the company?" The question carried exhaustion more than anger. Francesca looked at him. "No. Why not?" She considered the answer carefully. "Because the company employs people who did nothing wrong." Dylan leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he seemed uncertain about what to say. "You waited," he said finally. "Yes." "You let the company grow?" "Yes." Dylan shook his head slowly. "I thought you disappeared." Francesca's expression softened slightly. "I was raising our son." The words landed gently in the quiet room. Dylan looked down at the table. Outside the tall windows, Chicago's skyline stretched across the horizon. The company he had built still existed. The trucks still moved across highways. The warehouses still operated. But the story he had told about ownership had changed. And the person who now held the majority of that story had never needed to shout to make it happen. Francesca picked up her bag. "I hope the company continues to succeed," she said. Then she walked toward the door. The days following the board vote were surprisingly quiet. No dramatic headlines appeared in the business press. No public scandals erupted. The ownership correction was filed within corporate documentation and disclosed through the company's regular reporting channels. For most outsiders, it appeared as nothing more than a technical restructuring. But inside Holloway Logistics, the atmosphere had shifted. For years, the company had revolved around Dylan Holloway's authority. Now that authority had changed shape, not vanished, but no longer absolute. The first formal meeting after the ownership adjustment took place the following week. This time, Francesca attended as majority shareholder. She arrived early the same way she had during the previous board session. Mark Sullivan was already in the room reviewing financial projections. When he saw her, he nodded respectfully. "Good morning. Good morning." He hesitated before speaking again. "The bank representatives will be joining remotely today." Francesca understood what that meant. Great Lakes Capital Bank wanted reassurance. Ownership disputes could make lenders nervous. Francesca took a seat at the table and opened the financial report Mark had prepared. The numbers told a story she had already suspected. Holloway Logistics had grown quickly over the last several years. New contracts, additional warehouses, a larger fleet. But the expansion had also created heavy obligations. Loan covenants, operational costs. Logistics companies lived in a delicate balance between movement and margin. Too much expansion too quickly could strain even successful firms. Mark pointed to a section of the report. Our biggest pressure right now is fleet financing. Francesca nodded. The trucks purchased last year. Yes, and the interest rates increased. Mark looked slightly surprised. You already reviewed the financing terms. Francesca gave a small smile. I used to review contracts. Mark returned the smile. That's becoming clear. The meeting began shortly afterward. Board members joined the call. Bank representatives appeared on the screen. Karen Whitfield summarized the legal resolution. The ownership correction has been fully documented and filed, she explained. There are no remaining disputes regarding the equity structure. One of the bank officers spoke. As long as governance remains stable, our financing agreement remains unchanged. Francesca listened carefully. When the bank finished outlining its expectations, she spoke for the first time during the meeting. Holloway Logistics will continue operating under the current executive structure. The statement carried weight. Several board members exchanged glances. The bank representative nodded. That continuity is encouraging, Francesca continued. My goal is operational stability. Nothing more. No declarations of authority. No dramatic leadership speeches. Just clarity. The meeting ended within an hour. Afterward, several board members approached Francesca privately. Thomas Greer, the senior investor, spoke first. I expected you to push for immediate changes. Francesca shook her head. Sudden changes create instability. Thomas studied her carefully. You understand corporate governance well. Francesca answered simply. I understand systems. Across the room, Dylan had remained quiet through most of the meeting. For the first time since the company's founding, he was no longer the most powerful voice in the room. Yet, Francesca had not attempted to remove him. That fact unsettled him more than open conflict might have. When the room finally cleared, only the two of them remained. Dylan stood near the window. Chicago traffic moved far below. You're leaving me in charge, he said without turning around. Francesca closed her folder. I'm leaving the company operational. Dylan turned toward her. That's not the same thing. No. He studied her. You could replace me. Yes, but you're not. Francesca looked at him quietly. Leadership isn't punishment. Dylan gave a short, tired laugh. That's generous. Francesca shook her head. It's practical. He walked back toward the table. For 6 years, I assumed you disappeared. Francesca did not respond. I thought the illness, everything, had broken your life. Francesca met his gaze. It changed it. Dylan looked down. I told people you were unstable. Yes. I told investors you weren't involved in the company. Yes. And you never tried to correct me. Francesca folded her hands calmly. People reveal themselves over time. Dylan exhaled slowly. You waited, yes. For what? For the truth to be documented. The words were not spoken with bitterness. They were simply factual. Dylan leaned against the table. I spent years building this company, I know. And now, I'm working for you. Francesca shook her head gently. You're working for the company. That answer ended the conversation. Dylan had no immediate response. Francesca gathered her things and walked toward the door. Francesca. She stopped. Why didn't you try to humiliate me in that meeting? Francesca turned back. Because she understood the question. Public humiliation would have been easy. She could have repeated his words from years earlier. She could have reminded the board that he had abandoned her during cancer treatment. But she had not done any of those things. Because humiliation doesn't repair systems, she said. Dylan watched her carefully. And revenge, Francesca considered the word. Revenge is loud, she said. Accuracy is quiet. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Francesca nodded politely and left the room. In the weeks that followed, Holloway Logistics stabilized. Operational reviews corrected several financial inefficiencies. Fleet costs were restructured. vendor contracts renegotiated. Employees noticed the changes gradually, not through announcements, but through improved clarity in decisions. The company continued moving freight across the Midwest. Trucks still rolled out of warehouses each morning. Dispatchers still coordinated routes. For most employees, the ownership correction remained a distant corporate detail. But inside the executive offices, the balance of power had quietly shifted. And the person holding that power did not use it to dominate. She used it to steady the system that had once nearly collapsed under the weight of someone else's ambition. 6 months after the ownership correction, Holloway Logistics looked almost the same from the outside. The trucks still carried the same logo. The warehouses still operated along the highways stretching across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Dispatch screens inside the operations office continued blinking with route updates and freight schedules. For most employees, the company had simply moved through another quiet corporate adjustment. But inside the leadership structure, the atmosphere had changed in subtle ways. Decisions now moved more slowly, more carefully. Financial projections were reviewed twice instead of once. Contracts were examined with greater attention to long-term risk. Many employees assumed those changes came from the board. In reality, the influence came from someone who rarely raised her voice during meetings. Francesca Holloway attended board sessions once a month. She did not sit at the head of the table anymore, unless protocol required it. Most of the time, she listened. She reviewed reports. She asked questions that often seemed small at first, but revealed larger patterns. How does this expansion affect our debt ratio next year? Have we confirmed the supplier compliance update? What happens if fuel prices rise 10% this quarter? The questions were simple, but they forced the room to slow down. Mark Sullivan had noticed the difference almost immediately. One afternoon after a meeting, he approached Francesca in the hallway. "You know something interesting," he said. Francesca looked up from the folder she was carrying. "What's that?" "Your questions are making everyone more cautious." Francesca smiled faintly. "That's not a bad thing." Mark nodded. "Not for a logistics company." He paused for a moment before continuing. Dylan's style was different. Francesca did not respond immediately. Mark finished the thought carefully. He moved fast. Yes, and sometimes too fast. Francesca closed the folder. "Speed creates opportunity," she said. "But it also creates risk." Mark gave a quiet laugh. "You sound like an operations manual." Francesca shrugged slightly. "Systems matter." Across the office floor, Dylan continued working as CEO. The first months after the ownership change had been difficult, not because Francesca interfered. She didn't, but because the structure around him had shifted. For years, every major decision had ultimately depended on his authority. Now that authority existed within a framework he did not fully control. Yet, Francesca had never used her majority stake to challenge his role publicly. Instead, she watched, observed, exactly the way she always had. One afternoon, after a long strategy meeting, Dylan stopped outside the conference room where Francesca was gathering her notes. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Francesca looked up. Yes, they walked toward the quieter side of the office overlooking the loading docks below. For several seconds, Dylan said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "I expected something different." "Different how, after everything that happened?" "I thought you'd try to push me out." Francesca looked down at the trucks moving slowly across the yard. Would that improve the company? Dylan hesitated. Maybe not. Then why do it? He leaned against the window frame. Most people would. Francesca considered that quietly. Most people weren't trying to survive chemotherapy while raising a 4-year-old. The statement was calm, but it carried the weight of memory. Dylan exhaled slowly. "I know I failed you." Francesca didn't respond immediately, because the truth of that sentence had already been established years earlier. "I'm not here to discuss the past," she said. Dylan looked at her. "You never talk about it." Talking about it doesn't change it. He nodded slightly. That sounds like you. Francesca turned back toward the conference room. I have to leave soon. For Ethan, yes. How old is he now? 12. Dylan absorbed the number quietly. He had missed many of those years. Not entirely absent, but distant. Phone calls, occasional weekend visits arranged through careful schedules. Never the daily presence he once might have had. He's doing well, Dylan asked. Yes. Francesca's answer carried quiet certainty. He likes science. Dylan nodded slowly. That sounds like you. Francesca smiled faintly. He likes building things. For a moment, the conversation drifted into something almost ordinary. Then Dylan spoke again. I used to think strength meant control. Francesca waited. But watching how you handle this, it's different. She tilted her head slightly. How so? You never tried to win? Francesca picked up her bag from the conference table. I wasn't trying to win. Then what were you doing? Francesca paused before answering. Correcting the record. Dylan looked down at the floor. That's what this was for you. Yes. And now Francesca walked toward the door. Now I go home. Outside the office building, the afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Traffic moved steadily along the streets. Francesca walked toward the parking garage where her car waited. Her phone buzzed as she reached the elevator. A message from Ethan appeared on the screen. Mom, don't forget the science project tonight. Francesca smiled as she typed back. I won't. The elevator doors closed quietly. Upstairs, Holloway Logistics continued its work. Freight schedules, shipping contracts, the steady rhythm of a logistics company moving goods across the Midwest. Inside the boardroom, the corrected ownership documents remained filed permanently in the company's records. They told a story no one could rewrite, not about revenge, not about victory, but about patience, about documentation, about a woman who had once been left behind during the most fragile moment of her life, and who had returned years later, not with anger, but with the quiet authority of the truth she had carefully preserved. In life, some betrayals explode loudly and leave immediate scars. Others unfold quietly hidden inside ordinary days. The story of Francesca Holloway was never about dramatic revenge. It was about endurance. 6 years earlier, she had been sitting in a hospital room, facing a diagnosis that could have taken everything from her. Her husband walked away when the future looked uncertain. At the time, many people might have assumed that chapter would define the rest of her life. But survival has a way of changing perspective. Francesca did not fight back with accusations. She did not chase confrontation. Instead, she did something much quieter and far more powerful. She paid attention. She kept records. She allowed time to reveal the truth that others tried to hide. And when that truth finally reached the places where it mattered, bank statements, legal filings, corporate ownership, it spoke for itself. The result was not humiliation. It was not spectacle. It was something rarer. Dignity. Francesca did not destroy the company Dylan built. She stabilized it. She did not erase his role. She simply corrected the foundation on which it stood. Sometimes justice does not arrive through loud moments. Sometimes it arrives through patience, through details, through the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to forget what really happened. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. These stories travel far, and it's always meaningful to see how many places they reach. And if you appreciate stories about quiet strength and truth that takes time to surface, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. There will always be more stories like this one. Stories where dignity in the end speaks louder than revenge.